Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce one of the outstanding researchers in the field of UFO studies. Dennis Balthaser moved to Roswell in 1996 to pursue his interest in ufology after retiring from the Texas Highway Department in El Paso with 33 years in civil engineering. Prior to that, he served 3 years in the U.S. Army Engineering Battalion. He was the UFO investigator and served on the board of directors for the International UFO Museum between 1996 and 1998. Today, he's an independent researcher, investigator, journalist, and lecturer. Dennis has done over 350 TV, radio, and other media interviews related to and since the 50th anniversary of the Roswell Incident in July 1997, including CNN, MTV, Sci-Fi, The Today Show, Dateline, Nightline, NBC, ABC, Nightly News, Jeff Rense, Sightings on the Radio, Ted Loman's Off the Record, Rob McConnell's X-Zone Radio Show, Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM, Discovery Channel, National Geographic, and most recently the History Channel, to mention a few. Dennis is a certified UFO investigator with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and is a board member of the advisory board for the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association. His main areas of research comprise the 1947 Roswell Incident, Area 51, underground bases, and the pyramids of Egypt. He currently writes editorials for 31 websites and for UFO Magazine pertaining to his research, and works closely with well-known researchers Stanton Friedman, Frank Warren, Scott Ramsey, and many others. Dennis's award-winning website, www.truthseeker@roswell.com, has had over 1 million visitors since 1998. Please join me in welcoming Dennis Balthaser.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Glad you all could be here this afternoon, get out of the heat. Got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to get right with it. As an introduction, since the Roswell incident allegedly occurred in the summer of 1947, let me start this presentation with a question. Why are we still talking about it 65 years later? Surely this is not a story made up by some rancher in a remote area of New Mexico to draw attention to himself, and surely it wasn't some researcher or another looking to make a fast dollar, because the investigation and the research about the Roswell incident didn't even begin until the late 1970s, some 30 years after the incident occurred. The people involved did not get together and decide to fabricate this UFO story, because for the most part those people didn't know each other until many years after it happened. Enough volumes have been written and documented about the Roswell incident to fill the largest archives available, and yet it continues to mystify us. Could it be that what happened near Roswell did in fact happen, and it's being covered up by our military and our government? Many indications seem to lean that way based on factual information, witness testimony, and the fact that it cannot be satisfactorily explained away with the excuses we've been given over the past 65 years by the United States Air Force. We've been given 4 excuses by the Air Force over the past 60 years, and I'll explain each of them later. The purpose of this presentation is to give you information about the Roswell incident from my perspective, having been interested since the 1980s. I'll explain the events of 47 as I understand them, and when possible, we'll update you on some of the latest events dealing with these topics. My background is civil engineering. Having retired from the Texas Highway Department in 1996 after 33 years in that profession. I'm somewhat familiar with the military, having spent 3 years in the Army in an engineering battalion prior to that. I was also affiliated with the UFO Museum in Roswell as a full-time volunteer from 96 until 98, as a board member and the UFO investigator. During that time, I had the opportunity to meet and compare notes with some of the very best in the field of ufology. and to meet and get to know many of the actual witnesses. I continue to work with well-known researchers like Stanton Friedman, Scott Ramsey, Frank Warren, Don Burleson, and several others. I take this research work very seriously because not only do I think we deserve to know the truth, but I think our children or our grandchildren deserve it also. So I'll try to share what I know about the 47 Roswell incident with you. We'll look at some of the witnesses and people directly involved. I'll show you pictures and relay first-hand accounts of witnesses with you, and ultimately, you will have to decide if you believe, as many of us do, that an extraterrestrial craft with beings crashed near Roswell in 1947 and is still being covered up today. If time permits, later I'll share a personal experience with you that I had in '97 while attempting to obtain physical evidence that changed my life and created an even stronger desire for me to obtain the truth. Some of us that are serious about ufology believe that this has been going on for thousands of years. As an example, some researchers say that there are many references in the Bible that can be interpreted as relating to ufology. One is the book of Ezekiel, which refers to flying fiery wheels. What about the ancient civilizations and the technology they possessed, such as the Egyptians, the Mayans, and the Incas? We cannot today, with our modern technology, build anything as accurate as the Egyptian pyramids. Where did they get that technology, and what happened to it? Look at our technology today. How many of you, or perhaps your parents or grandparents, as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, ever dreamed that you could pick up a telephone without wires, or sit in front of a keyboard and by clicking a few buttons, you could instantly communicate with anyone in the world? Did we have help getting some of that technology? Some think we did. UFOs have been reported throughout recorded history. However, the term flying saucer was first affiliated with a gentleman named Kenneth Arnold 2 weeks before the Roswell Incident on June 24th, 1947. Mr. Arnold, experienced pilot, was flying his private airplane in the state of Washington near Mount Rainier when he spotted 9 craft that he was not familiar with traveling at tremendous speed. Knowing the distance between Mount Rainier and Mount Adams, he was able to calculate that speed at over 1,300 miles per hour. This was in 1947. After landing his plane and being questioned by the media about the craft he had seen, Mr. Arnold did not describe the shape of the craft, but rather the erratic movement, which he said was similar to a saucer skipping across water. The media picked up on this term, and even today some people refer to them as flying saucers. Most researchers today, however, refer to them as UFOs, unidentified flying objects, which means just that. They are not identifiable as anything we know. 99% of what people report as UFOs are identifiable as man-made objects or natural phenomena. It's the 5 or 10% that are unidentifiable that we're interested in. There were other reports of flying saucers or discs during the same time period from other witnesses. However, what happened near Roswell, New Mexico 2 weeks after the Arnold sighting has lingered on for over 60 years. As an example of the UFO sighting activity prevalent during just 1947, Larry Hatch released a map of 1947 sightings, which involved a 15-year project to accomplish from a multitude of sources, notably Jan Aldrich and other list members of Project 1947, a highly respected historical ufology group. The sightings on this map are indicated by white marks. And just in New Mexico, there were 15 to 20 sightings that are very prominent in 1947. The size of this wave was unprecedented as unexpected. Terms like great airship and ghost rockets fell by the wayside. The flying saucer age began with a bang. With this many sightings shortly after World War II, it was no wonder why the government and the military were concerned. Some have speculated whether the sightings had any relationship to our species using the first atomic bombs during the Second World War. and the fact that the first atomic bomb explosion took place in 1945, less than 100 miles south of Roswell at Trinity Site and White Sands Missile Range. Were they laying out there observing us and decided to come a little closer to see what was going on? Another theory for the Roswell incident was the Japanese Fugo balloons. Reader's Digest published a book entitled Secrets and Stories of the War in 1963 that contained an article about the Fugo balloons, which were developed by the Japanese after the first bombs fell in Tokyo, April 18, 1942. It took the Japanese 2 years to develop their reprisal, but starting in November 1944, 9,000 were released to float across the Pacific Ocean at an altitude of 30 to 35,000 feet on prevailing winds at 100 to 200 miles per hour. They were designed to drop incendiary and fragmentation bombs on the United States. They appeared everywhere from Alaska to Mexico. At the end of April 1945, the balloon barrage ceased. This is not what happened at Roswell, since the Roswell incident occurred in 1947, 2 years after the balloon invasion was stopped. The Roswell incident actually died just a few days after it happened, and many of the local residents of Roswell knew nothing about it until many years later. You have to understand things were a lot different in 1947 than they are today. Some examples of how things were different back then include the fact that the ranchers had no telephones. There were 2 radio stations and 2 newspapers in Roswell at the time, no TV, and more importantly, people felt very differently about their government than they do today. If you were involved with the Roswell incident as a civilian or in the military, and you were told to shut up for national security reasons, you did. You didn't question people in authority because you trusted and respected them. I wish we had that today. Many times at lectures, I'll ask the audience to name 5 people in the government they respect. Time's up. As a researcher and investigator, I contact witnesses that were involved, and several of them, still 60 years later, refuse to talk about it. Why? If they were career military, they're afraid of losing their retirement, while still others share fear for themselves and their family's safety. And still others are just that dedicated and committed to not revealing anything because they promised their government they would not talk about it, and quite possibly they will take their experience to the grave with them, as many already have. We're running out of time because the people that were involved are now in their 80s, if they're still alive. I think here, before I explain some of the events of the Roswell incident to you, it's important for me to tell you a little about the military base at Roswell and who was stationed there in 1947. Construction of the base began on September 1st, 1941, and was completed in May 1942. Originally known as the Roswell Army Flying School, the name changed to Roswell Army Airfield in September 1942. The group stationed there in July 1947, when the Roswell incident happened, was probably the most unique, well-qualified group of individuals ever organized by our military. They were known as the 509th Composite Bomb Wing. That probably still doesn't mean much to you until I tell you that they were the only atomic bomb group in the world at the time, and in fact were the same group that dropped the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the Second World War. These were not ordinary GIs. These were the best we had. The best pilots, the best navigators, the best everything, and we're supposed to believe that they were responsible for handling and delivering the atomic bombs, but too dumb to know the difference in a weather balloon and a flying saucer. Today, the Enola Gay B-29 airplane that was one of the airplanes assigned to Roswell after dropping the bombs, and information about the 509th are on display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Also today, the 509th Bomb Wing is a B-2 stealth bomber stationed in Missouri. They were without a doubt placed in the history books of time by being the only group in the history of the world. 'World" to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons, and hopefully the last. 'World' to utilize nuclear weapons Were they also placed in the history books as being involved with what could be the biggest story of the millennium? Involvement with a civilization from another world? I suppose time will tell if they get in that history book or not. The commanding officer of the 509th Bomb Wing and the base commander was Colonel William Blanchard. Blanchard had to be shot to be in charge of the atomic bomb group and post commander. And even though he was ridiculed and embarrassed publicly for his actions in the Roswell Incident, he eventually went on to become a 4-star general at the Pentagon in Washington. He was also Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force and considered for Joint Chief of Staff the top job in the military. That's quite an advancement in position for one who supposedly messed up over actions in 1947 dealing with a weather balloon. Roswell Army Airfield became Walker Air Force Base when the Army and the Air Force became separate entities in the late 1940s and remained a key bomb group during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, B-52s sat on the runway out here, crews on board, engines running, loaded with bombs, changing shift every so often for 3 days. Had we needed to go into Cuba, these guys would have been airborne in 3 minutes. There's not a whole lot left in Roswell as far as structures of what was here in 1947. A few things that are. Hangar 84 is still there. The water tower is still out there. The infirmary is no longer there. There was a newer hospital built and Walker Air Force Base took over. This is part of a 13,000-foot runway. Here's some B-52s sitting on the tarmac down in the bottom. The airfield had one of the longest runways in the country at 13,000 feet to handle the B-52s. The base was deactivated and closed on June 30th, 1967. Today, the runways are still used and the base is now the Roswell Airport and Industrial Park. So with that brief description of how the term flying saucers came into being and now knowing who was stationed at Roswell in 1947, we can review some of the events that took place in that July some 60 years ago. When doing research and investigation about the Roswell incident, it's very difficult to distinguish between all the various reports that are circulated. Dates don't always match, although most serious researchers now agree that the crash occurred on July 4, 1947. Some reports are false, some are still classified, while others are missing. And that's what will keep us dealing with and investigating until such time that all the truth is known about what really happened near Roswell. It would take a lot more time than I'm allotted to present all the information, but I hope in this presentation you'll learn a little more about the Roswell incident, perhaps from a different perspective than you've heard before. There are several crash sites, one with much more credibility than the others, and the possibility exists that even other sites could be included with further research. Trying to understand the Roswell incident is a challenge unlike any I have ever undertaken, but worth the effort if the truth can be found. I will concentrate on the corona debris site since that one is the most documented and believable based on the information available. What I'll talk about is 3 different sites. Well, that's actually 4, but on the map I'm showing 3. The Corona debris site is the one that I put the most confidence in. Here's the town of Corona. It's about 12 miles southeast of the little town of Corona. Roswell is down here in the corner. This is the Corn Ranch site just north on 285. And out here in the Capitan Mountain west of town is the alleged Braxville site. A lot of people ask me why it's called the Roswell Incident if it happened at Corona. Well, the military was at Roswell, so naturally they got involved and it became the Roswell event. Prior to the crash on the Foster Ranch near Corona, New Mexico, there was activity noted for a few days about strange objects in the sky as witnessed by several individuals in Roswell. 2 Catholic nuns, Mother Superior Mary Bernadette and Sister Capistrano were looking out the third-floor window of St. Mary's Hospital at the change of their shift late on the night of July 4th, 1947, when they saw a flash and something fiery go into the ground in the distance. They made a note in their logbook and believed it was a disabled aircraft. We've never been able to locate that logbook. We believe it's at the Vatican, and the Vatican won't give it up. The site I mentioned as being the most credible with documented information is located 60 miles northwest of Roswell. During a severe thunderstorm, about 11 or 11:30 on the night of July 4th, there was a ranch foreman on the ranch named Mac Brazel that heard an explosion louder than thunder. The next morning, he went out on horseback to check his sheep and look at the windmills for damage from the storm the night before. When he came upon a debris field, several hundred feet wide by 3/4 of a mile long, filled with pieces of debris. There was so much material that his sheep wouldn't go across it. He had to lead them around it to get them to water. He gathered up some of the debris and put it in an old shed at the ranch until he could get to town a few days later. On the advice of a neighbor he had shown some of the material to a day or two after recovering. Another site today known as the Corn Ranch site is located approximately 22 miles north of Roswell and 4 or 5 miles west of US 285, which goes north from Roswell through Malm to Klein's Corner and west on I-40 to Albuquerque. Don Schmidt and Kevin Randall made this site famous in a book in the early 1990s. The theory for this site is that the craft came down on the ranch near Corona, hit the ground and went airborne again, impacting at this site. There were reports of bodies in a triangular-shaped craft. The Corn family bought this ranch in 1976 from the McKnight family who owned it in 1947. One of the McKnight family members signed a notarized affidavit that I helped obtain, stating that the family had homesteaded this ranch in 1901 or 1902, and to his knowledge, no UFO ever crashed on their ranch in 47. He was emphatic that had any military retrieval of anything been done on the ranch, they would have known about it, as getting to the site would have been impossible because of the terrain without going past the ranch house. Today, very few researchers believe that the Corn Ranch site was involved with the Roswell incident. However, the possibility exists that this may have been a diversionary site by the military witnesses. As with nearly everything else related to the Roswell incident, it remains a possibility until such time as the truth is known. The third site I'll discuss is known as the Jim Ragsdale site. This location is some 43 miles straight line distance west of Roswell in the Capitan Mountain. It's approximately 3 miles south of Pine Lodge Road that runs from Roswell west to Capitan, New Mexico. Ragsdale claims to have been at Boy Scout Mountain with a woman friend when I quote, "We were laying in the back of my pickup truck, buck naked, drinking beer and having a good old time about 11:30 on the night of July 4th, 1947, when all hell broke loose." End quote. Ragsdale claimed that looking toward the northwest, he saw a flash in the sky brighter than a welder's arc, and something fiery coming toward the campground, taking off the tops of trees as it came in, and crashing about 60 yards from his pickup. Ragsdale, in his story, first made public in 1993, went into detail about the bodies, which he referred to as little people, and gave a vivid description of what the inside of the craft looked like. A few of the problems encountered by researchers with Ragsdale's story was the fact that he gave two different statements of his account on two different affidavits. So the Ragsdale story, although no longer verifiable by him since he died in 1995, also remains questionable until further documented truth is brought forward on the site and whatever connection, if any, it may have had with the Roswell incident. Perhaps by now you're beginning to realize how difficult it is to investigate an event such as Roswell, since no stone can remain unturned and no witness's account can be ignored. Other sites have also been mentioned, as Stanton Friedman, nuclear physicist, and the original civilian researcher on Roswell, has talked about the plains of St. Augustine to the west of Socorro, New Mexico, involving a mid-air collision of two craft, with one going down on the plains and the other at the Corona debris field. The Socorro site would be out west of here, out Socorro, the town of Socorro, and it'd be out in that area, in the plains of St. Augustine. When Ranch Foreman Mike Brassel decided to come to Roswell with some pieces of debris that were scattered all over his ranch, he stopped at Sheriff Wilcox's office to see if the sheriff knew what the material might be. Wilcox didn't know what it was, so he contacted the Roswell Army Airfield and talked to Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer for the 509 bomb wing. When Marcel learned about what the rancher had in his property, he and Captain Cabot, the counterintelligence officer, followed Roswell back to the ranch. Arriving at dusk, too late to see anything, they spent the night on the ranch in an old shed, going to the debris field the next morning. They collected as much material as would fit in their vehicles to take back to the base. Major Marcel, however, decided to stop by his house before returning to the base and woke up his wife and 11-year-old son, Jesse Jr., about 1 a.m. to show him the material. Some of the material was brought into the house and laid out on the kitchen floor and examined. Jesse Jr. would later describe the material as 3 types: a small I-beam-like material with writing on it similar to hieroglyphics, very thin material, and material which would be referred to as bakelite or plastic material today. According to witnesses that handled the material, the thin material could not be torn, burned, or dented, and when crumbled up, it returned to its original shape in a few seconds, showing no creases. Both Major Marcel and Jesse Jr. are 2 of the most credible witnesses to the whole Roswell incident. Major Marcel received commendation and recommendation letters before and after the Roswell incident for his intelligence work in the military. I have in my files 10 or 12 of these documents, including one that was issued August 12, 1948 by Colonel John D. Lyon, who went on to become Air Force Chief of Staff. A pretty impressive source for a commendation. Marcel himself was recommissioned in 1948, assigned to the Strategic Air Command, Chief of Foreign Intelligence Division, and later to a top-secret special weapons project. Partly the type responsibilities assigned to an individual that couldn't tell the difference between a weather balloon and a flying saucer. Major Marcel was again involved in the cover-up to the form, which I'll explain later in this presentation. That's a current picture of Jesse Jr. Jesse Marcel Jr., Major Marcel's son, recently retired as a medical doctor in Helena, Montana, and also recently served in the Mideast as an Army helicopter pilot and flight surgeon in the reserves. He was called up to active duty at the age of 68 to go to Iraq. I don't often recommend books, but if you read no other book about Roswell, I'd suggest Jesse Jr.'s book, The Roswell Legacy. When hearing about the ranch foreman's story, Walt Whitmore, owner of radio station KGFL, decided to drive out to the ranch and brought Mac Brassel back to town in order to obtain an exclusive on his story, keeping him overnight at his house, and after making a wire recording of Brassel's story for the radio station. That recording would never be aired on the radio station, as the Federal Communications Commission informed the station that if the recording was aired, they would have 24 hours to find something else to do because they would no longer be in the radio business. The military eventually located the rancher in town, picked him up and took him to the base, keeping him under guard and interrogated him for several days. When finally released, the ranch foreman's story had changed and he no longer talked about it. In January 1999, I located Mac Brassel's gravesite and discovered a few interesting things on the grave marker. For many years, his nickname Mac was spelled M-A-C, but on the tombstone it's M-A-C-K, which is not very important to most people except to researchers. Right there is a Mason's emblem. This poor rancher was a Mason. His wife Maggie was Eastern Star. That was surprising to me. However, as I did some checking, I found out that most people that were involved, particularly the military, Most people that were involved in the Roswell incident belong to the Masons. That's a whole other lecture. But it seemed a little odd that they would all belong to the Masons. By the time Ranch Foreman Mac Brassel returned to his ranch, all evidence of the debris was gone. The military had apparently brought in many soldiers to thoroughly comb the debris site, and all the material picked up at the site had been taken back to Roswell Army Airfield, where it's been reported that 10 to 12 cargo planes were used to transport that weather balloon out of here, with most of it going to Wright Field at Dayton, Ohio, which today is known as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Perhaps some debris may have also been shipped to the National Lab in Los Alamos in northern New Mexico. Some of us believe that today much of the material may be at Area 51 in Nevada, which also for many years didn't exist according to the government. There are several well-documented reports from witnesses pertaining to guarding the material and even seeing the bodies in Roswell at Hangar 84 on the base prior to it being shipped out. That hangar today is referred to as Building 84 at the Roswell Industrial Air Center. That's basically what it looked like in 47. Under orders from Base Commander Colonel Blanchard, which probably came down from higher up in the chain of command, Public Relations Officer of the 509th, Lieutenant Walter Hutt, was told to write an article for distribution to the local news media that Roswell Army Airfield had recovered a flying saucer on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. Hutt questioned Blanchard before writing the article on July 8, 1947, and it appeared not only in the local Roswell Daily Record that afternoon, but also in many of the major newspapers west of Chicago. To my knowledge, this is the only media report in the history of the United States admitting to the existence of UFOs and actually having one in our possession. I've always had a lot of respect for Walter Hutt, and during my 2.5 years as a volunteer at the UFO Museum, from 96 until 98, I visited with him daily, discussing many aspects of his interesting life, both his personal life and his military career. In November 2000, Wendy Connors, a historical ufologist, and I requested and received permission to do an oral history interview with Walter for the benefit of his family and for historical value and research. During that taped interview, Walter stated several things to us that we believe he had not previously discussed publicly with anyone. The information he shared pertaining to his involvement in the Roswell incident will require validation by other witnesses, referring to the bodies, the craft, and a possible meeting held on the base on the morning of July 8th with key personnel present. Walter resigned his commission in the military in 1948 and resided in Roswell for the remainder of his life until he passed away on December 15, 2005. I've always been amazed how many other people that were involved with the 1947 incident stayed in Roswell after they got out of the military. The article that Walter wrote had the headline in the Roswell Daily Record on July 8, 1947. I have those for sale in the back. There's copies of those I get from the Roswell Daily Record. I mentioned earlier that the Air Force would issue 4 excuses for what happened in Roswell during the 60-some years since it happened. This newspaper headline, written by Walter Hutt on the approval instructions of a United States Army Air Force Base Commander Colonel Blanchard, was the first. We had a captured flying saucer in our possession. These were without doubt busy days and with extremely high security on the base and the surrounding area of Roswell until the military and the government could get a handle on the situation. Young local mortician Glenn Dennis was employed by Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell at the time of the incident. Glenn's involvement has been reported hundreds of times in books and documentaries, and although it basically is the same each time, researchers have raised many questions over the years about his involvement and his method of handling that involvement. On July 5th, Glenn said he received several phone calls at the funeral home from the base asking about the chemicals required in embalming fluid and what effects effect bodies exposed to the elements would have on body tissue, stomach content, etc. He was also called and asked how many hermetically sealed children's coffins he had in stock at the funeral. According to Glenn Dennis' account, he took an injured airman out to the base in the funeral home ambulance who had been injured in a vehicle accident in town. Ballard Funeral Home had a contract with the military base for ambulance service and funerals. When he arrived at the base infirmary, he noticed metal debris in the back of several Army ambulances parked at the rear entrance to the base hospital. He asked questions when he got inside the hospital, assuming there had been a plane crash, and was threatened by a 6'2" red-headed captain, basically being told, if you go into town and spread any rumors, they'll find your bones out in the sand. He also saw a nurse that he knew very well coming out of the storeroom with her face covered, nauseated, who told him to get out of here before you get in trouble. The next day, at the nurse's request, Glenn met the nurse at the officers' club, where she explained that she had been involved with a pathologist taking notes during the examination of bodies. She described the beings to him, and according to Glenn Dennis, she drew a picture of an alien hand and face on the back of a prescription pad and gave it to him. According to Glenn, the nurse was suddenly shipped out the next day, supposedly to Europe, where shortly after it was reported she had been killed in a plane crash. There is no record of the plane crash. Mr. Dennis, because he said he made a solemn oath to the nurse to not reveal her name, has not revealed it in these 60 years. He did, however, send 2 well-known researchers on a wild goose chase for over 5 years with the wrong name. When questioned about the drawing given to him by the nurse, he stated that he misplaced it or lost it. You can imagine the importance of these 2 pieces of evidence in trying to help solve the Roswell incident. The piece of paper with the drawing and the name of the nurse, which thus far Glenn has not satisfactorily explained to any researcher. Many of Mr. Dennis's other claims pertaining to whom he knew and how he was involved are also being seriously investigated. We've also never located the red-headed captain and others he mentioned, so the investigation continues. With things apparently progressing expediently at Roswell Army Airfield pertaining to secrecy, crating, and loading the debris and bodies up for shipment out of New Mexico, General Roger Ramey, in charge of the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Texas, which Roswell Army Airfield was under, summoned Major Marcel, the intelligence officer I mentioned earlier, to Fort Worth with some of the debris, so that Ramey could see it and make a public announcement. If in fact there was a meeting in Roswell at the base that morning with General Ramey present, why was it necessary for Major Marcel to fly the debris to Fort Worth that same day for Ramey to see it? Perhaps that was part of the cover-up decided at the earlier meeting so General Ramey could discredit the incident. This is apparently well planned, because when Marcel arrived in Fort Worth, he was taken to General Ramey's office with the debris he brought with him and told to put the packages of debris on the desk, since Ramey invited Marcel into the map room so he could show the general where the incident happened. When General Ramey and Major Marcel came out of the map room, the debris that Marcel had brought with him was no longer on the desk, and in its place was a damaged weather balloon on the floor. That expression on that face tells me I don't want to be here. A couple of things on that picture. There is an unopened package. That's probably what Marcel brought with him. I have another picture I'll show you, but this brown wrapping paper, I have some questions about it. Having myself been in the military, Ramey's statement to Marcel when Marcel questioned him about where the debris was that he had brought with him is to me one of the classics in pulling rank. General Ramey told Major Marcel, "You pose with the debris for the pictures and I'll answer the questions." Up until the time of Marcel's death in 1986, he continued to state that the material he posed with for the pictures in General Ramey's office was not the same material he had brought to Fort Worth from Roswell. James Von Johnson, a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper, was summoned to General Ramey's office at Roswell Air Force Base to take the pictures, which he did. However, much later he also embellished his knowledge and involvement, which two other researchers and I questioned and interviewed we did separately with him. Those interviews are posted on my website at truthseeker@roswell.com. That's another picture of Marcel. This brown paper here bothers me because if he had debris wrapped up in brown paper and carried it all the way from Roswell to Fort Worth, by the time he got there, that paper would be crumpled, wrinkled. That's off of a brand new roll of brown paper. I don't look at pictures for pretty faces. And that is definitely a weather balloon on the floor. And in that particular picture, you can't see the package in the background. I met and interviewed James Von Johnson a few years before he passed away, and there's no doubt that he took the photos in General Ramey's office, but he had also embellished his involvement. One of those pictures is of particular interest to us researchers 60 years later. I'm sure General Ramey didn't realize in 1947 that someday in the future, the technology would become available to analyze photographs through computers, enlargement, and other means to possibly hold the general responsible for possibly proving the truth about the Roswell incident. In this photo, General Ramey is kneeling down on the left. Seated next to him is Colonel Thomas DeBose, Chief of Staff of the 8th Air Force. If you look closely at General Ramey, he's holding what appears to be a teletype message. What's important about that teletype is the fact that the writing, the printed type, is facing the camera. It's right here. That gives you a good picture of the paper that I'm saying is off of a brand new roll of paper. The message on that paper, part of that message on the paper is a 2-line enlargement of the teletype message done by researcher David Rudiak. Others have also analyzed the memo, and so far there's agreement in the ufology community that the following words appear on the teletype. Disc, victims of the wreck, forwarded to blank at Fort Worth. Now there's only 14 words in the English language that have the letters V, 2 I's, and an S in the same location as victims. And I don't believe violins, Yiddish, yipping, or virgins have anything to do with the crash disc recovered in Roswell in 1947. Line 7 mentions a weather balloon, believed related to the cover-up story. Would it not be interesting if the man who helped cover up the Roswell incident in 1947, General Ramey, 60-some years later would be the same person that might finally reveal what happened near Roswell through a photograph taken years ago? It's an interesting scenario. So General Ramey, probably under instructions from Washington, had the cover-up in place with pictures to prove it. What happened at Roswell a few days ago was not a crash flying saucer, but merely a weather balloon that members of the elite atomic bomb group, the 509, misidentified. The next morning, July 9th, one day after the newspaper headline of July 8th stated, "We captured a flying saucer," there was a new headline, authorized by General Ramey, stating, "General Ramey empties Roswell saucer." This was excuse number 2. The cover-up was now firmly in place. Perhaps people have asked over the years why it was called the Roswell Incident. Like I said a while ago, it is because of the military being here. With the issuance of General Ramey's statement, the whole incident was pretty much put to rest. And because people back then respected the military and the government, they accepted this excuse, and not much was said or done about the incident until 1978, 31 years later. During those years, there were other reports of sightings worldwide, but Roswell was pretty dormant until a nuclear physicist named Stanton Friedman Interested in compulsion and ufology, was told about a retired Major Jesse Marcel living in Yuma, Louisiana. Friedman interviewed Marcel on February 20th, 1978, and the investigation of the Roswell Incident began again. Other researchers like Blitz and Moore and a few others also got involved. Since then, hundreds of witnesses have been interviewed, perhaps thousands, and new names continue to be located and interviewed when possible, as Roswell just won't go away. Doing Friedman's research in hundreds of libraries and archives, he eventually came upon documents which referred to as Majestic 12 or MJ 12 that showed without a doubt that a written policy was in force to cover up anything related to UFOs. Several military projects such as Project Sign, Project Grudge, and I suppose the most popular to the public, Blue Book, were done to explain the phenomena of all the sighting reports being received. Project Blue Book, however, most of us believe was nothing more than a way to pacify the public and assure them that there was no threat to our country from UFOs. Several hundred of the thousands of reports investigated on the Project Blue Book remain unexplainable to this day. It was originally believed that Majestic 12 was set up by President Truman as a means of controlling all of the information coming in about flying saucers and aliens, etc., as written by Truman to the Secretary of Defense James Forrestal on September 24, 1947. Some researchers are looking at the possibility that the letter is not authentic and that Truman's signature may have been lifted from another document. The list of members belonging to the original MJ-12 group is quite impressive. Personally, I believe a similar group exists today, under a different name, and surely with different participants, since the last original member of Majestic 12 died in 1984. It's interesting to note that 3 of the original members of the Majestic 12 became the first 3 directors of the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, which along with the Defense Department and NSA all came into existence about the same time in 1947. Of all the information available about the original members of MJ-12, I find the information about James Forrestal to be some of the most interesting, particularly his death. He had been Secretary of the Navy in September 1947. President Truman named him as the first Secretary of Defense. He resigned in March 1949, was soon hospitalized and analyzed as being mentally unbalanced, prior to supposedly committing suicide. There are still many questions about his death, still unanswered today. Additional Majestic 12 documents have surfaced during the recent past, which are currently being analyzed to determine if they're factual, disinformation, or a hoax. The original documents were received at the home of Jamie Shandera, a Los Angeles TV producer and writer, in December 1984 on a roll of unprocessed 35mm film, which when printed revealed what appeared to be photographs of alleged secret government documents describing the recovery of a crashed extraterrestrial craft in the New Mexico desert in 1947. Today, the original documents are also being questioned as possible hoax or disinformation. Since code names were normally only used one time, and the word magic referred to the cover name used to decipher the Japanese diplomatic code in 1940. Now, if you have any trouble believing that things such as UFOs involving thousands of people in the cover-up can't be kept secret for years, keep in mind that the Manhattan Project involved more than 50,000 people between 1942 and 1945 at a cost of $20 billion in today's money to develop the atomic bomb. Breaking the enemy codes involved at least 10,000 people, and no word of that got out to the public until 25 years after the war. Area 51 in Nevada has been in existence as a secret underground base 85 miles northwest of Las Vegas since the 1950s. And the government didn't admit to anything being there until 1995, when an additional 5,000 to 8,000 acres was required for national security. We found out about it in the 1980s through a Russian satellite picture. The F-117 stealth fighter we found out about during the Gulf War in 1991. But the technology, planning, and testing went back 20 or 30 years. It is now taken out of service and replaced with a Raptor. And I can assure you that other aircraft designs are being worked on. Earlier I said that the newspaper headlines of July 8th and 9th, 47, were the first two excuses given by the Air Force for what took place near Roswell. The third excuse came out September 8, 1994, when the United States Air Force released a 2.5-inch thick report entitled The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. In this voluminous document, author Colonel Weaver stated that what the Air Force concludes is that what was recovered near Roswell wasn't a flying saucer with alien bodies, nor was it a weather balloon, as General Ramey stated in 1947. Instead, the wreckage probably consisted of balloons, radar reflectors, sonobuoys, and miscellaneous junk from a highly classified Project Mogul balloon assembly. Project Mogul's objective, but not the equipment, which by the way was started in 1946 and highly classified, was to develop a constant high altitude balloon which could monitor sounds produced by a Soviet nuclear explosion thousands of miles away. The first Soviet nuclear explosion didn't take place until 1949, 2 years after the Roswell incident. On July 29, 1995, the GAO, the General Accounting Office, released their report about Roswell to New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff after his extended request to several Washington-based departments such as the CIA, Department of Defense, FBI, to research records concerning the 1947 crash. The GAO report stated that numerous records of Roswell Army Airfield, which should have been kept, had been destroyed, which included administrative records from March 1945 through December 1949 and outgoing messages from October 46 to December 49. How convenient. Records for the only atomic bomb group in the world in 1947 that dropped the bombs in Japan during the Second World War were destroyed. What else has been destroyed, or has it been? The fourth excuse, but if you're a wagering person, probably not the last one, was ironically released 2 weeks before the 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident in June 1997. The Air Force timing was exceptional, since Roswell was getting a lot of coverage for the 50th anniversary worldwide. Many people had bought into the Mogul balloon story put out in 1994, and the Air Force would have been much better off leaving things alone. But when they issued the latest report entitled The Roswell Report, Case Closed, they shot themselves in the foot. That report was an embarrassment to anyone in the Air Force, and for those of us that have read it, it contains so much inaccurate, misleading, and wrong information that there's no doubt that the Roswell incident is not resolved, based on the excuse we've been provided by the Air Force. What they basically stated happened near Roswell in 1947 in this 219-page written report by Captain James McAndrew is that it was a balloon dropping dummies. I will not waste your time or mine to go into any details from this report dealing with the excuse given. But what happened in Roswell was anthropomorphic crash test dummies dropped from balloons. Crash test dummies were not used until 1953, 6 years after Roswell happened. I think the report was an insult to the intelligence of the American people, and even though the report was entitled Case Closed, it is not. I said at the, I guess I'm asking, was there still a cover-up 60 years later? I told you at the beginning of this presentation that I'd share an experience with you I had in '97, which I was totally unprepared for. At the time, I was affiliated with the UFO Museum in Roswell as a full-time volunteer and UFO investigator. On May 27, 1997, a phone call was received from a gentleman in Oklahoma who told me that his dad had just informed him that he had been stationed at Roswell Army Airfield in 1947 as a military policeman. He also stated that his dad told him he had been on guard duty at the crash site and guarded the ambulances bringing the bodies back to the base hospital. He said his orders were to shoot anyone that got close to the ambulances. In a later phone interview I had with the elderly gentleman, he told me he didn't know if he could have shot another American, but those were his orders. While at the crash site, he picked up a piece of metal, debris, stuck it in his pocket, and 50 years later still had it, but now wanted to get rid of it, telling his son people would kill over that piece of metal. He and the son were very concerned about confidentiality and the safety of their family, which was their reason for calling to see if I wanted the metal. I took 5 pages of notes talking to the father as he explained his duties at Roswell and the fact that he had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer with 6 months to live. Several calls were made between the son and I from my residence to set up a meeting for me to drive to Oklahoma, meet the father, get the medal, and hopefully interview him if the family agreed to that. I drove to Oklahoma on June 13th. Tried to contact the son, but the phone number had been given in order to set up a meeting time for the next day. I was told by a woman that answered the phone, he's out of town on an emergency. The next day, I laid around the hotel all day, calling the son 3 times and getting a recording each time. By 2:30, I figured it was a hoax and a wasted trip. At 3:30, my phone rang at the hotel, and a woman said, meet him at Dennis restaurant at 7 o'clock. So I went to Dennis, and a man and woman walked in, fitting the clothing description I had given on the phone. He said, are you Dennis? I said, yes. We sat down in a booth. First thing he told me was, the gentleman you plan on meeting will not be at this meeting. I said, who are you? He said, we're special agents of the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigation, and we answered directly to Langley, Virginia. I don't really go into a lot of detail here about how I felt when he told me I wouldn't meet who I came to see and that they were with the Air Force. I asked him, how did you know I was coming over here? And he said, we knew Monday you'd be here Friday. I said, is my phone tapped? And he smiled and said, you know how we do business. I spent 3.5 hours with these 2 people who I had never met before discussing the piece of metal I was supposed to get. The Roswell Incident, Area 51, and a lot of other things related to ufology. He had a New Mexico map. We talked about the crash sites, and he had drawings of UFOs. I didn't take any notes during our meeting, so when I got back to the hotel, I made as many notes on a cassette recorder as I could remember. And on the drive back to Roswell the next day, I wrote notes on a pad as I remembered things that had been discussed. I came back to Roswell empty-handed, never got the medal, or met the son or the father. 2 days after returning home, I called the son to find out what had gone wrong, as I felt betrayed since we had an agreement about confidentiality. The son was very nervous on the phone and didn't want to talk about it because he said, there's still someone here. At which time another voice came on the phone informing me he was another agent that was flown in from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. That phone call lasted about 20 minutes. A few weeks later, I called again, missed the son, and asked that he call me back collect. Never called. Then on December 26, 1997, I called again, as I had checked with the phone company to see who the phone in Oklahoma was listed to. And I believe I talked to the female agent. I had her on the phone about 10 minutes, putting a lot of pressure on her, when a male voice came on the line and said, if you keep messing with the OSI office, you're barking up the wrong alley. Click. That was the last I heard from him. This is under investigation for 12 years. With the help of researcher Frank Warren, several Freedom of Information Act requests were submitted to the Air Force and to Congress by Larry Bryant, with no response from either the Air Force or Congress. Possibility of a hoax or I was set up or scammed was always a possibility. And if that was the case, someone had broken some serious laws by impersonating federal agents, interstate telephone violations, not providing me with proper identification, and invading my privacy. I dealt with 5 or 6 different individuals over a 6-month period. That's a big hoax. I mean, what was their motive? If they were real agents, we still had a cover-up very much in place 50 years later in 1997. And it wasn't any weather balloon with crash test dummies that came down near Roswell. Through the diligent work of Frank Warren and myself, it was discovered 12 years later that the interception was a setup and that an individual responsible had done several other similar scams on other people. For me personally, it was a real experience for a period of time and eventually accomplished nothing to help resolve the Roswell incident. But it does show what teamwork and perseverance and good research can accomplish in time, being able to finalize a part of my research, not with the end result expected or hoped for, but finalization. So there you have the Roswell incident from my perspective. I've tried to give you some history about UFOs, an overview of some of the events pertaining to the event, and particularly some of the witnesses and their statements. I've also given you some of the investigation going on and shared my personal experience with you. We can't possibly cover 60 years of history and research in this brief explanation. But if you came here knowing nothing about the Roswell incident, it's my hope you're now a little better informed. If you already knew about it, maybe I shed a different light on it than you've heard before. As an investigator and researcher and lecturer and journalist, I don't permit myself to ask you to believe it. That's your decision. I can, however, tell you that something happened 60 years ago near Roswell, New Mexico in July 1947 that many of us believe is still covered up by the government, and we want to know the truth. I'll conclude with a quote I like to use. Always telling the truth is never having to remember anything. Thank you. I think we have a little time for a question or two if you want to follow something at me. Yes, sir?
What was that last one you said, the hoax? What were they trying to get?
He's asking on the interception what they were trying to accomplish. That's the million-dollar question. I have no idea what their motive was. Hang on here. That was a big problem for me. I didn't know what their motive was. And then after 12 years of research, good research, we found out through a woman that I think was the agent, turned out to be the guy's ex-wife, that he had done this before. This was his way of getting kicks. For me, it wasn't funny. I went to Oklahoma, I came back, I lost 18 pounds in 3 months. In the morning, I put tape over the hood and fender of my pickup, an old police trick. And if the tape is broken, you don't start the engine because somebody's been messing with it. I'd get back to my residence, I didn't know what I'd find. All my phone calls were made from my home instead of from the museum, because I figured the museum phone was tapped. Found out later my phone was tapped. But it was an experience that I'll never forget. If I ever get the opportunity to do that again, a couple of things will be different. I'll either have somebody else with me, I'll have myself armed, because I was told by some pretty high people in the military that had I got the medal, I would have never seen the monster. I'd have never had that. So it was an experience, and I didn't know whether to continue to talk about it at lectures or not. And Frank Warren, who worked with me, in fact, Stanton Friedman, when it happened, I had told Stanton Friedman about it, and Stanton said, go public. He said, if something happens to you, we at least know why. I suspect. But it really did make a difference. When I went public with it, it was like a weight lifted off of me, and it was out there. And it was publicized for a long time. Yes, ma'am?
Do you believe that there have been more recent crashes since then?
The government what?
Do you believe there have been more crashes?
Been more?
Yeah.
She's asking if I believe there have been more crashes. And for a matter of fact, 1948, March of 1948, Aztec, New Mexico, east of Farmington, up in the northwest part of New Mexico. 99-foot craft with 16 bodies, intact. It didn't crash, it landed. Yes, some kind of malfunction with the craft, came down. I've been working with Scott Ramsey and Suzanne Ramsey from North Carolina. He has researched this for 26 years. He's got a new book out, The Aztec Crash, Heart Canyon. Excellent book. He worked 26 years on the book. Nobody knows about this incident because there's only ever been 2 books written in the 1950s and 1980s. and there was a lot of controversy. But Scott has done some excellent research on this, and I believe it's a real event, happened March, 10 months after Roswell. And the key here is that the government and military learned a lot in Roswell. So I said there was no publicity for the Aztec crash. No newspapers, no radio, nothing. So nobody knew about it. But if you get a chance, you might go online and check on the Aztec crash, Hart Canyon, and see if you can find the book. It's excellent. Yes. Yep.
I think you left out with Representative Schiff soon after that, all the trouble we caused him, he died of cancer.
Yeah, good point. Congressman Schiff, shortly after the GAO sent that report out, it was a facial cancer, wasn't it?
Something on his ear, I think.
Something in the ear or something, some form of cancer that he died of shortly thereafter. Yes, ma'am.
These people that met you at Denny's restaurant, did they have identification?
No, that was my fault. I should have required identification. I gave him my card. He already knew everything about me, probably. But, you know, the fact that it was a hoax, I can look back on it now and see a lot of things that I could have done differently. The woman with him didn't talk much. She just sat there. I found out later that she then became his ex-wife, so I guess that's why she wasn't talking much, maybe. But it was just an experience that is very, very hard to explain. But I went over there fully with the intent that I was onto something. If I can find the myth, if I can talk to the father, and I believed them on the phone. They were sincere on the phone. If I could get the myth, that's going to change history. So I was very concerned about the whole event. And then 12 years later, when we discovered it was a hoax, I was disappointed in a way, because it wasn't the results I wanted. But I was extremely proud, through the research that we did, that we were able to put an end to it. And that's the end of that story. I hope you all got a little, yes, sir?
That paper that he was holding in that picture, are they looking any more at that to see if there's any?
Not yet. He's asking on Ramey's memo, where the print is showing towards the camera. David Rudiak's doing a lot of good research, and several other people have, and hopefully they'll be able to read some more of that. There's quite a few words. I think there's about 7 lines of words, but the word victims of the wreck tells me a lot, because mobile balloons didn't have victims. Don, how are we doing on time?
I got 25 till.
What time do you start? 3:30?
3:15.
Oh, 3:15.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be right with you. Yes, sir.
Okay. When you were talking about the hoax, did you actually say you found that your phone was actually tapped
Yeah.
during that period of time? Do you
Mine
know whether
was,
that was
yeah.
a federal tap or whether it was
I don't know if it's a federal or not. I just know it's happened.
I'm curious as to whether or not it was an inline tap or if it was something that somebody put on your house.
No, it was an inline.
Okay.
Yeah. There was nothing physical in the house. Today they can do it by satellite. They don't need it.
I've actually had to have an investigation done to find a tap before, and it actually happened to be in '97, and it just so happened to be that it was connected to Oklahoma. I have no idea why, other than the fact that the person that I worked under at the time was always being watched because he was considered to be kind of off the beaten
Well,
path.
yesterday in my Area 51 lecture, I talked about the satellites can read a newspaper from 200 miles up. So today, they're going to tap your phone. They do it with satellite.
Well, this was in '97, and it
Yeah.
was my home line.
Oh.
And I actually managed to find a number because this was during caller ID starting to come in and out, and people were starting to figure out how to block that. Well, they accidentally called the house, and it was the Oklahoma City federal office, but it was a military branch of that federal office because I know that he was a captain, but he answered the phone in such a way that I would not understand his name, only understood his rank, and that it was very important what he did. That's all.
You're a UFO researcher?
Me?
Yeah.
No. I plan on it though, because I've already been tapped once. Why not?
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dennis, just to let I'm a Roswell UFO researcher and kind of the new kid on the block for a little bit, but I've done quite a bit. I can tell you right now that and I know for a fact that there is an organization or the government still has a vested interest in Roswell. I have had information intercepted at a friend of mine's house where they ransacked his house and basically took a data CD that I sent him. The only person that knew that was coming was myself and my friend. I had a FedEx package that was intercepted going to Arizona State University to have some analysis done on some metallic debris. It was the second one, the second of a series of analytical work that was supposed to be done. The only person that knew that that package was coming was the professor at the university and myself. Nobody else knew. However, it got to ASU. It sat in their mailroom for 1 hour, and the professor said that the package was unopened, and when she got it, the material that I put in it was gone. So this is the type of stuff that happens all the time.
Yeah, I mentioned MJ-12. That group is gone because they're all dead. But I would guarantee you, I would wager that there is another group today, probably under a different name.
I knew a guy
The
with
two people
509.
that I think would
last
probably
name
be
was
involved
Davis,
with
maybe.
it is George Bush Sr. and Henry Kissinger. I'll bet they're both on that group. Now, I got the chance to talk to Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, 3 or 4 times. We did a conference together up at Aztec, and he went outside, and I went outside to talk to him one-on-one. And I had heard that he knew something about Roswell. He was born in this area, just south of here near Mortician. So I said, Dr. Mitchell, what do you know about Roswell? He looked me right in the eye and said, Dennis, it happened. Edgar Mitchell is one of the top people, brilliant people in the United States. If it comes from him, I'm going to go with it. And then he said, that's all I can tell you. He said, my parents knew all the ranchers. They knew about it. And he said, I've been in the military. He said, I had people that I knew that knew about it. Then he told me we have 2 governments. We got a black government, we got an elected government. I said, who do they answer to? He said, they don't. Which is probably similar to MJ-12. Somebody is pulling the punches. And one of the questions I always have is, who's handling this country and where are we headed? I'm really concerned about our children and our grandchildren. And young people that are here, I'm going to beg you, start asking questions and demanding answers of your leaders. The Roper poll that I had on display yesterday, 68% of the people in the United States believe in UFOs. 78% think it's covered up by the government. Those are higher percentages than the politicians get elected by. It's time for Washington to start paying attention to the people and remember that the country was founded on we the people, not on some bunch of lies like we've been getting for years. And it's not just UFOs. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation today. I hope you learned something. And I'll be back at my table and we'll be here tomorrow to do another one. Yes, sir.
Tell them about Presidio.
Presidio is going to have a conference, the first annual conference in October dates.
October 19th and 20th.
October 19th and 20th. It's going to be the first UFO conference in Presidio, Texas. We talked to Brad back there at the table. He's got some brochures. Yeah, one more question, quick.
I grew up about 150 miles northwest of here. In 1945, a guy up there that lived in that area was out driving up his cows to get them into milk just before dawn. Totally black. 1945. All of a sudden, the sky lit up, and it died back down and became totally dark.
I know what you saw.
And so they passed, the rumor immediately passed around that community that an ammunition train in southern New Mexico exploded last night, and the FBI is investigating sabotage. Everybody was worried because they said you can't trust anybody around here if we got saboteurs in this area.
Yep.
And after Hiroshima, they told the truth. And there were 2 groups of scientists from Los Alamos. One group of the scientists came down closer to the atomic bomb explosion. The other group landed on top of Capilla Peak, which is about another 80 miles north of there to watch the atomic bomb. They knew exactly when it would go off, but they were safe because they figured it'd be bigger than it was.
I was out near Socorro. San Antonio is the town where the Al Cafe is, right?
Yeah.
I went in the Al Cafe one day out there. They got great cheeseburger, chili cheeseburgers. And the woman who owns it, her dad, Hilton used to have, that was where Hilton had his first hotel. And Oppenheimer and his crew used to go in there into the bar and the restaurant and stayed at the hotel, that motel. Well, the guys were in there one night, they worked out in White Sands, and they told her dad, if you go out about 5:30 in the morning, you'll see something you've never seen. So sure enough, he went out the next morning at 5:30. He saw the flash of the atomic bomb tested from about 40 miles away. Oppenheimer went down there the next day and was tromping around in that dust up to his knees and said, maybe we shouldn't be out here. They had no idea what they were playing with. But that story you're saying, that confirms what the guy out in San Antonio, New Mexico saw. Thank you all very much.
She's lived here for 5 years. You gotta go make a phone call for her. Oh, you gotta go, don't you? Go ahead. Go find out what's going on.
My son lives in Boston, rural areas. He loves this country. I think you're and I called him and just tell him. I'm going to get my t-shirt. No, I'll see if I get my orange. Yeah, I think we're going to head over there.
She does now. She's located in Africa.
Just a couple of quick announcements. Our next presentation will be in about 30 minutes at 3:15. And Dr. Don Burleson, the State Director for MUFON, will bring us the connection between the death of Marilyn Monroe and UFOs. You'll want to hear that in about 30 minutes. We're also taking a tour to the Roswell Army Airfield in about 15 minutes. If anybody's interested, we have some slots still available.